Greetings, Internet. So this video of mine is a response to the XPlanations YouTube channel, responding in part of a recent video of theirs to a comment of mine on another one of their videos concerning Christian divine command theory as it might apply to the morality of the Marvel Eternals movie or the Avengers Age of Ultron movie. But real quick up front, I want to go ahead and answer the XPlanations' direct questions to me, make some clarifications and concessions, just to get things squared away. One, yes, a reference to genocidal Jesus is a reference to Jesus' self-prophesied second coming, where he intends to return with an army of angels to terrorize and eternally torment most of humanity. Arguably, just about any version of eternal punishment, as modern Christians conceive of it, is a crime against humanity on par with any existential threat coming from any major comic book supervillains. Two, a concession. I concede that, in fact, the Soul Stone, not the Mind Stone, is the highest current-ranking divinity in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. However, the Soul Stone is also portrayed as having a psychic link with all the other stones and is their administrator, so to speak. Hence, whatever the Mind Stone would be up to is ultimately a product of the Soul Stone. Hence, Ultron's consciousness is a product of the highest divinity in the MCU. But more on that in a bit. You also asked, 3, do I find your videos entertaining? Yes, I like comic book recaps of comic issues I've only read in fragments over the years. Context is helpful. Also, I'm often enough curious how Christian philosophers process comic book superhero apocalypses, given how closely they parallel the supposed second coming of Jesus and also the Islamic return of Muhammad and, Muslim Jesus. So, does Iron Man negate divine command theory for Ultron? So going back to my concession in the second item, you argued understandably that Tony Stark's influence was upon the consciousness of Ultron, therefore sufficiently nullifying the divinity aspect. And I think there's some Bruce Banner in there too. You provide the clip of Scarlet Witch declaring that Tony Stark will, quote, do anything to make things right. Okay. So how do you know that's not exactly what the Soul Stone wanted, though? Going back to Christian divine command theory as it plays out in the Bible, we have God often utilizing random people for his own ends, whether that is famously Pharaoh during the 10 plagues of Egypt or someone else. They don't have to be committed Jews or Christians at all or have divine, intentions. Tony Stark is just a means to a divine end. And, back to divine command theory in the MCU, which brings us back to the ultimate question I posed to Christian comic nerds concerning the divinity of Ultron and Arishem in Marvel movies. Was it immoral for Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver to challenge Ultron and for the Eternals to challenge Arishem? I say it was the morally right thing for them to do, as morality, goodness, and righteousness are independent of any given authoritarian power structure that may or may not be at all affiliated with them to whatever degree. They don't have to be good. In the movies, the Avengers and the Avenger wannabes, the Eternals, challenged the divine authority, actual real-life divine authorities for them, in order to protect humanity. For the Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, who initially had no moral qualms about joining Hydra, aka the uber-Nazis Hitler was afraid of in Marvel Comics, this is like someone from the Proud Boys or Skinheads deciding that David Duke has gone too far this time. One would think that Christian divine command theory would lead to the conclusion that these characters were challenging legitimate divinity in their reality and were out of line to do so. So another fair point the XPlanations makes is that, in fact, in Marvel Comics, not the MCU yet, the Living Tribunal outranks the Infinity Stones. I would love to see the Living Tribunal in the MCU, and clearly he does indeed outrank the Infinity Stones in the comics, and in the comics, the Living Tribunal is not the top authority either. But notice how authority actually works. The celestial beings still have to listen to the Living Tribunal's judgments, and the Living Tribunal would have to listen to any even higher authority's judgments. And given the Infinity Stones are the highest authority we've seen in the MCU, they're in charge even if someone comes along later to trump them. Humans are clearly lesser on the divine totem pole in any of these equations, whether it's in the comics or the MCU. Certainly the Avengers aren't in any moral position to challenge any of the divinities above them. They just do so because they can, and they can get away with it. They think they are using the Infinity Stones, but it seems the Infinity Stones are probably using them, presumably to correct for the cosmic shenanigans of Thanos, who wants more death in the universe than has been divinely appropriated. I would assume. So around timestamp 2450 in the explanations video, which I'll link to in my description, or the video description here, he says that atheist critics, I'm assuming mostly me, maybe seen others argue such things, incorrectly declare that comic book genocidal and apocalyptic supervillains are often, quote, just doing what the Bible prophesied, end quote. However, the explanations was comparing What If Ultron to Jesus instead of the much more direct comparison of Avengers to Ultron. The What If Ultron is a different kind of comparison, but incidentally, it does actually compare. If you're going to compare What If Ultron to Jesus, then you'd have to acknowledge that typical mainstream Christian theology supposes God was fully within his moral right to simply punish sinners and provide no salvation whatsoever if that is what he so chose. Salvation is not an obligation in mainstream Christian theology. It's entirely voluntary on God's part. If Jesus was God of the multiverse, What If Ultron could easily be his angel of death, having judged all the universes as in need of cleansing. Ultron can't stand an iota of disorder, and Jesus can't stand an iota of sin, which is falling short of his brand of moral perfection. Do you know that Ultron's sense of disorder is at all different than Jesus' sense of being morally off in some regard? If divinity in the Marvel Universe inspired the Christian laws in the Marvel Universe's Hebrew Bible, then perhaps the same source inspired the incarnation of Ultron. If Christian writers took over Marvel Comics, they would have very little problem making divine ends meet here. So in typical Christian theology, Jesus would have been justified sending his angel of death to wipe out everyone in the MCU's What If multiverse. So the What If Ultron is just carrying out a slightly different Christian doctrine-compatible apocalypticism. The explanations argues that Jesus is supposed to bring peace with an iron scepter, but that What If Ultron seeks to bring peace through genocide with the killing of everyone and everything. However, God does this multiple times in the Old Testament, most prominently with Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham, in Genesis 18:16-33, pleads with God directly that if even one innocent person exists, the town should be spared. But as it turns out, every last man, woman, and child apparently is 100% guilty and unredeemable. But do you really suppose in the history of the whole world that there has ever been a single town in existence where literally everyone deserved complete massacre? Or is it more likely that these are petty and desperate human values being reified in stories and deified for posterity in the form of genocide apologetics? Humans have long had to compete and survive versus other groups of humans, and often preemptive genocide of a neighboring tribe was the smart thing to do, because of the perhaps founded conviction the other tribe might be doing the same thing to you and your clan tomorrow. Hence, we have the values and justifications of complete genocide and massacre ruminating and percolating in ancient morality. Even though God is immune to such petty affairs and could easily spare the innocent in a given evil town, even if it's just one person. Just as the gods had nothing to fear from Nimrod and early humans in biblical mythology building the rather short Tower of Babel up to the heavens where the gods live, we've sent the Voyager probe out of the solar system. Nimrod was not a threat. But these are just human stories, and they weren't thinking too far out of their own unfortunate firmament, were they? So what if Ultron massacring literally everyone in the multiverse is just as reasonable as the Old Testament God judging entire towns, nations, and even nearly the whole planet on occasion? Everyone in Christian theology is worthy of extermination. Just wait for your preacher to go off the rails declaring just how evil we all are, so as to incline us to gratitude for any chance of salvation from divine massacre. God happened to choose to save, just 8 people out of millions from the worldwide genocide of the flood? What if Ultron might have let a higher percentage of people than that live on accident, hiding in some obscure place in the multiverse? And note, Jesus himself uses the flood as analogous to what will happen with his coming wrath. Just with, fire this time instead of water, if that makes any difference to anybody. Then we go to the issue of few will be saved. When Scarlet Witch confronts Avengers 2 Ultron with his genocidal intentions for humanity, Ultron defensively and explicitly says in his defense that at least some worthy people have time to evolve and survive. Atheist writer-director Joss Whedon is almost certainly making fun of common Christian excuses for apocalyptic atrocity. The explanation says that things are completely different as precise guidelines to not perish have been given. The explanations even provides the quite apt biblical parallel of Christians being remade by God as a new man, a new creation, so that they are made worthy for the kingdom of heaven. And Ultron insists that in the movie that humanity must change and evolve to be worthy of being saved, and that they'll, have a reasonable amount of time to do so. Both Christians and Ultron are missing the big picture, that there's just no good reason to murder everyone else, even if they kind of suck in ways you don't like, right? No one cares that there's some technical way to avoid perishing. Joss Whedon was pre-mocking the defensive excuse. Hey, a few people will be saved. There's some reasonable means by which that can happen. It's all good. This is like the Spanish Inquisition declaring that they weren't being morally obtuse because people had the opportunity to agree with them rather than being tortured and murdered. So, to conclude with, I want to point out the horrific Christian character arc of everyone's favorite, most virtuous Avenger, poor Captain America. He spends 80-some years in the comics fighting off countless genocidal dictators, endless apocalypses, and horrific alternate timelines, and laying down his life over and over and over again for a whole planet, sometimes even whole universes of people he cares about, because he believed it was the right thing to do. And being the good Christian that he is, when Jesus shows up, he'd have to be totally fine with Jesus setting most everyone on fire. But don't worry, they deserved it this time. Eternals Part 2 will presumably feature a second coming of Arishem, where he's warned that humanity had better be worthy to live. Arishem ominously promises to return for judgment. This is a being who has been totally cool with whole planets of sentient beings being the disposable placenta of a celestial's birth cycle. Do you really suppose humanity is going to get some slap on the wrist for not measuring up? This is clearly written to echo the very culturally prevalent themes of mainstream Christian apocalypticism we find right there in the Bible from Jesus himself in the Gospels. Humanity is on the chopping block in any event. Does it matter if it's a celestial birthing cycle? Does it matter if they're all going to be annihilated in some way? Does it matter if they're set on fire for a short time or a long time? Does it matter if Marvel comes up with some innovative new way to punish humanity? Pick one. There are more than sufficient parallels here, and the morality just doesn't hold up. It's horrific. Any one of these is a classic comic book supervillain trope, and also very analogous with what Jesus himself in the Gospels promises to inflict upon humanity. Are there differences? Sure. Do they matter? Arishem, Ultron, and Jesus probably have different tastes in what constitutes being worthy of being saved. They also have extreme horrors to inflict on most everyone else. To me, at least, that makes their differences of opinion mere quibbles. Christian theology never had any excuses to begin with to even get us anywhere near here. Morally perfect gods don't create moral wildcards like libertarian free will because they have an absolute moral obligation from their perfect moral natures towards absolute evil prevention. No exceptions, as any conceivable exception is going to boil down to some logically indefensible version of perfection, now with blemishes. God's newly created angel Lucifer has a rebellious feeling. From where exactly? And the volition to follow through on it when the rest of the angels arbitrarily don't initially? Because of an angelic nature that could only have come from his creator? God had to build it that way. Adam and Eve were given and failed a morality test despite not comprehending the very topic of morality until after they'd failed the test. And all humans descended from them are born pre-cursed to toil and death, punishments that are explicitly portrayed as punishments in Genesis for crimes they could not possibly have committed, given they didn't even exist yet. Christian theology is wholly unjustified from the inception, long before we get to the outlandishly obtuse and irresponsible ethics of Judgment Day. And surprise, it's not justified there either. But I covered that stuff in other videos, so I'm going to leave it there for now.